Want your brand to be seen and be remembered? Effective campaigns need both. JC&Deco's high-quality billboard sites in premium locations nationwide offer brands powerful and visible stages for emotive, impactful and influential storytelling. Find out how JC&Deco can help your brand be seen and be remembered at www.beseenberemembered.co.nz. No mai, hoki mai, kia ora the fold, imahine, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa, and welcome back, Glen Kyne.
Kia ora, good morning, Duncan.
I think it's been maybe 2.5 weeks since we last did this, and such is the nature of this chaotic industry that there are sort of 6 different chunky topics that have kind of backed up in that time. And so I'm going to try doing a kind of a lightning round format. I'm about to punch go. We've got 6 topics, 6 minutes each, and we'll just see how we get through.
If we can keep to time, I will buy you a beer.
Okay, yeah, I'd be shocked, to be honest. What we're going to do is talk about, I'll give you a top line of what we're going through. We'll start with NZME, the fact that Grenon, the activist shareholder who's now on the board has been significantly upping his stake in the business. Talk about RNZ's challenges and troubles off the back of some very good reporting from Shane Curry. The abrupt and largely unsignalled end of the New Zealand On Air Film Commission merger. The news that Mediaworks is going to be broken in two and essentially part of it prepped for sale. The stuff versus the cops situation that is sort of brewing came out last week in terms of the audio of the sort of police radio that came out, was reported by Tony Wall, and finally Glenn's going to talk us through the emerging media powerhouse that is the sort of Skydance, Paramount and potentially WBD situation. So potentially TikTok, yeah. It's amazing what has happened on that front. So let's just get into it. I'm going to hit go now. So talk us through what's happened at NZME in recent times. We're sort of seeing a bit of a maturing of the Grenon as a meaningful part of their sort of governance and shareholding.
Yeah, so he obviously before the board changes, he was sitting around 10% in and around the AGM. He increased his shareholding further, and just in the last week or so, we've seen him increase his shareholding to around about 18%, which I think makes him the second largest shareholder, but also very close actually to being number one in terms of the largest shareholder.
Yeah, so you've got Spheria who are the biggest, and they're almost a block. That Grenon and Spheria seem very aligned. So, if you own 40% of the company with effectively two shareholdings, you're very, very close. You have effective control at that point, really.
You do, and what's really interesting, on the one hand, you kind of think about what are the motivations here. Why is this happening? Well, on one hand, it's a great demonstration of just confidence to the investor community around, what Jim thinks of that business. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, it is more around control and around the future of what happens with that organisation. And it's really interesting because as both a board member and a shareholder, first of all, as a board member, you have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the company and by default the shareholder. Obviously, Jim's both with a position of increasing authority and control as a shareholder around that board table. So really interesting dynamic.
Absolutely. What I sort of there's kind of two main strands to Grenon's kind of impact on NZME. One is that he came in with there was both a business critique and an editorial critique, and the editorial critique was sort of crystallized in the creation of an editorial board, which is composed of Josie Pagani, the sort of former Labour candidate, but now centrist sort of commentator, Brent Webling, who has had a number of different roles in and out of politics and journalism, Philip Crump, who Substacker, lawyer, briefly an NZME employee, and then Mariana Alexander, who former Weekend Herald editor, the person who drove the premium strategy, and is now, as I understand, chair of this group. It's a small group. It looks a lot more sort of, I guess, normie is how you'd put it, and the way that it engages with the organisation, I think, is largely through Michael Boggs and through Murray Kirkness, who's effectively the editor or the head of the editorial operation, and where that was once seen as this kind of scary barbarians at the gate situation, it very much doesn't have that appearance now. So the kind of Grenon increasing his shareholding, which could have been viewed quite, as quite an aggressive act, taken in concert with the sort of normalising of relations with the editorial board, doesn't look as worrying in some respects.
Have you had a chance to read through the charter and also look at the article that the Herald published in isolation last week, which outlined editorial standards and values and different things? And I was curious when the Herald published that article without context as to why. And then when I read the charter, obviously very important, part of the constitution of NZME as part of their documentation. It didn't read scary at all, right? It read very balanced. It read, very centrist. It read, very much about facts and balance and important things that I think we'd all like to see in editorial. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a world where the impact of the editorial board is actually positive for the sort of rank and file journalists there, because right now when you have a board that, like you say, is predominantly has a fiduciary duty, is trying to hit some commercial numbers, it can view editorial through the lens of just another means of achieving that end. Whereas if you have a different kind of set of values that where certain kind of tensions in the kind of commercial and editorial can be litigated and can actually go up to the board, I think that could be no bad thing. The one thing I would say is that Grenon, as well as having the kind of editorial and kind of the business critique that came out, there was also a notion of potentially splitting the company up, and I don't think that's completely off the table still, and that his shareholding is very significant, but if the company were to be broken up, it would naturally have the potential for him to take a greater degree of control of a constituent part of it, whether that was the Herald or some kind of combination of that. So it's very much a watch this space thing. I gather that Grenon and Joyce have become quite close through this process. We'll see how it goes. Have you seen any demonstrable change in editorial output on quality?
None whatsoever, personally. I think that the Herald is doing a lot of difficult things at the same time, but I don't see that it has changed markedly over the last 6 months, personally. All right, that is 6 minutes. Let's talk about RNZ. So they have had a pretty rough few weeks. You had the Sutherland report come out, which was highly critical of the on-air product, and there actually I have heard change. There's a lot more of a kind of commercial radio style crossover between the shows. It just feels like more of a populist kind of product versus the somewhat austere, I'm mainly talking about Morning Report here, approach. That came out and sort of seemed, in the aftermath of voluntary redundancies, you had some fairly high profile people leaving. You also had last week, and I think that this really illustrates how hard the job is, to give RNZ some credit. It sounded like there's a proposal to close off Matinee Idol, this sort of movies discussion show. Then you had Sam Neill, a sort of beloved cultural figure, come out, and he said, this is a quote that I think he put on Instagram, so who is running RNZ? What cloth-eared clowns got that job? Fix this, the country is angry. It has very much shades of what happened around the Concert FM Youth Network thing, and you're like, it's just hard to change something like that.
Well, you've had Glen Kyne leave just very recently as well, a very important voice inside the leadership team.
Yeah, Megan as well. So it's a tricky thing. Nonetheless, you have to stay the course, and I think the sort of the general vibe is that Paul, as leader, is not exerting sufficient control of the organisation to kind of, that's how it feels from the outside, is that that there is a sense that it needs to bulldoze through some of these barriers rather than be kind of cowed by them. And I sort of like Sam Neill types are going to be mad, and there might be something in it, but if your intention is to sort of transform both the on-air and the sort of digital outputs of the product and keep those things in motion rather than frozen by people's attachment to them, you just have to look across the ditch, right? Look at the ABC and the way that they approached. They have bigger audiences, bigger budgets, and they have just very deliberately shut down some really popular shows, not like off-peak weekend programming, but like big primetime TV shows that had decades of legacy, because it seemed so important that that you make way for new things.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure there's a tougher gig. A public-owned media company, everyone has a voice, everyone has a stake. Everyone is commenting, clearly RNZ have lost the kind of narrative of confidence of late. That's really evident. Whether it's, celebrities like Sam Neill, whether it's government ministers, whether it's us talking about it, everyone at the moment has a view on RNZ. And interestingly, even in competing media companies that don't really compete because they're commercial compared to RNZ non-commercial, are not happy because RNZ's encroaching into its space, right? So there are these voices and forces just pushing in on this organisation. And when I think about that, there are two things for me that are really crystal, very, very important. One, the alignment of the board and management is very, very fundamental in how they interpret the charter. And that charter being a document that they can all sit behind, and as you say, they can actually make really bold strategic decisions because the charter enables them to do it, and there can be an alignment and confidence between board and management to then project that back out into the world. Something doesn't quite seem right in that mix, and I'm not sure where it is. But as I say, they're certainly losing the narrative at the moment.
It's interesting. I normally am a very devout RNZ National listener, but have been kind of switching back and forth between that and ZB because they're clearly sort of paying attention to that and trying to take some lessons from commercial talk. And even with, it just makes you realize how long it takes you to develop a muscle memory and for things to become natural. This week, for example, Mike Hosking has been talking with his producer about this sort of plastic plate on the underside of his car, and it's become a multi-day, very kind of gentle, ridiculous saga that has sort of played out, and it's in the kind of 5:55 until 5:57 slot, and it's good, entertaining radio. It has no kind of public service or even aspiration to it. Then you switch over to RNZ, and they're talking about ice creams, and it's just a little bit forced because they're learning it, and they will get better. And this is something that's been kind of not the done thing until it was the done thing, and it just makes you realize that even with the best of intentions and some very highly qualified people, it's still hard.
One of the things that's incredible about ZB is the tenure of hosts and the tenure of leadership that have sat around that. You haven't had a lot of owners of content. I think you got Jason Winstanley, head of radio, Dallas Gurney prior, and these people have been in their roles overseeing these things for a very, very long time, and so there's real continuity and knowledge around best practice around diving in to these things, and you can see that paying off in ZB, right, time and time and time again.
Which is interesting though, right, because that's also the critique of RNZ is that they have had some people in roles for a very long time, but also that when they've had the opportunity, it hasn't really refreshed it. So, it's tricky.
Yeah, a lot of change in radio lately, and around who's making decisions.
Yes.
So I think there's been a lot of change around that, and that's probably been to their detriment. And of course, on one hand, I feel a bit sorry for them because they have absolutely executed on the multimedia strategy around growing audience across different distribution channels, and that's what we want our public media asset to do. It needs to be more relevant and meet audience where they are.
Yeah, I just think that but yeah, I mean it's.
The one thing that they've let go of is obviously clearly the radio element, and it's not to say that they should be beating Hosking, but it should be as relevant as it always has been,
and feel as urgent as that. It just doesn't have that sense of urgency. We are over time, so I'm not getting that beer. Sadly, I'll have to buy it for you.
That was part of my plan.
Yeah, I saw that. I feel as culpable too. Let's talk now about the end of the New Zealand On Air Film Commission merger. I feel like, 10 days ago, I was talking to people sort of close to this, and it had a very kind of on-off kind of a winter. Speaking to people within film and within television, they might have had critiques or fears about it, but there was an overall sense that merging these two agencies made sense. That is the way the wind's blowing. It is what they do in Australia, and that it was going to happen, and that the focus from an industrial sense was how do we make this the best version of what it can be and cause the least sort of chaos on the way through, and also that it had moved from a maybe to a more likely posture, and then I feel like it was days later, it's just suddenly off. And not a big announcement, just no, we're not doing that.
Have you had any insight or heard anything as to why?
No. I mean, my assumption is with these things, with all media reform, it's largely a 3-year cycle thing, and it's a lot of work, a lot of stakeholder management, a lot of public a lot of noise for something that on a total economic level doesn't make film is a big industry, TV, especially the sort of SPIG eligible productions, it's non-trivial. However, merging those, it's almost like a capital gains tax. You merge those entities, and in 5-10 years you'll start to see some significant rewards from that. However, in the immediate term, you're going to have a lot of sort of basically just merging pains, and you've got an election in a year's time, and that's the sort of, I don't know, that's my working assumption. You heard anything different?
No, I haven't, but I think you're probably spot on. There's not a direct, any benefit that comes from it is marginal at best in the short term.
And the politics of it, right? Like I assume that right now, with Luxon kind of battling for his political life, polling, both personal, prime ministerial and party, they'll be testing everything against, does this help us get elected again next year? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, almost certainly no. And so if that's your test of everything that's coming down the pipe, it had no shot.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, we where are the rest of the media reforms at? I mean, we probably instinctively know, but we haven't also heard, direct comment on the other things.
My standing invitation to Paul Goldsmith to come on the fold and talk about that remains live. We just by way of illustration in some respects, a year ago, we had a meeting here. It was very much a when, not if. Now I don't even get replies to my requests. And it just, and I don't blame them for that. I'm not someone who's going to be kind of righteous about it, but it does kind of illustrate the extent to which media reform has gone from something that they seemed really interested in to something that they is a combination of fear and disinterest, the further we go into it.
Yeah, and I think, the government would have seen, I imagine, a lot of positive things happen, in their eyes, in their context, at least in media, with, TradeMe coming in as a shareholder of Staff.
True.
And, QMS taking 100% ownership of Mediaworks, some of
Even
these.
Grenon coming in and there being a kind of a sense of motion at NZME.
Sky buying 3,
Yep.
all of these things would have been seen as, positive innovations. And part of that is also good, that the industry is not waiting or relying on government intervention anyway to kind of get on with what they need to do.
Yeah, during the last government, everything from the sort of PIJF to the kind of COVID-19 related ad spend to the Te Puna Kairangi, fund from New Zealand On Air, it did feel like we got into, as a sector, a posture of waiting and hoping and lobbying versus what can we do, so in some ways, the big government theory of get out of the economy and let them do their business is kind of working in some respects, even if the big structural challenges to media remain.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to the future for Mediaworks. So, this is a company reasonably well, or at least half of it. Tell me what's happened there.
Yeah, so we talked a little while ago about QMS buying out Oaktree Private Equity, buying out their remaining percentage. They're 100% owner now of Mediaworks. And I think we talked at the time, we speculated a little bit that there might be some change coming in a couple of weeks ago. That was announced, where the out-of-home side of QMS in New Zealand that sits under the Mediaworks banner is going to be carved out and report directly through to the Australian business. And so QMS will look like a Trans-Tasman out-of-home operation with, management reporting line changes, etc., all happening. And then radio in New Zealand being a standalone business, still being led by Wendy Palmer, but being a standalone business. And then speculation, obviously, around, okay, what does that mean for the future?
Well, it looks a lot like the conscious uncoupling of stuff last year, which we were told at the time meant nothing, and but very quickly meant something, and presaged TradeMe's 50% investment into Stuff Digital. This, don't think anyone is even pretending that this doesn't allow for a sale of the radio assets. So the
or big, outdoor.
True. But, certainly the people I've spoken to at Mediaworks are operating under the assumption that radio is the part that doesn't make sense for QMS. That's not the sort of core of their business. The interesting thing is more about who would a natural buyer be. Sky have tried to go there and been chased away before. I can't see that coming back. Stuff, I don't really see it. NZME literally couldn't. So the sort of big operations, it doesn't make sense domestically, though there is a lot of action in the Australian radio market. You've got a number of different companies. You've got Nine with a big bag of cash. Whether they'd want to come back to New Zealand, who knows? But the chance of it connecting up to a big radio group in Australia seems almost more likely than something emerging in a domestic sense. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's some interesting dynamics that sit behind whatever potential activity does occur. So you've got out-of-home, despite downturns in the Australian New Zealand ad market, outperforming relative to other platforms and continuing to grow and continuing to say there's a lot of capacity actually in that sector into the future. So valuations likely to be strong, in the near to midterm for out-of-home. And the reason I say that that's potential acquirers for that exact reason. There's still value to be captured by an acquirer. Equally, QMS could be listed on the Australian stock market as an entity as well for private equity to get a return. And we need to remember that private equity, need to have a path to a return. And so I wouldn't say QMS is off the table at all. With radio, range of options, and radio has been, I guess, forever, and well, not forever, but for a decent amount of time in Mediaworks history, there were people that made approaches around radio, and as you quite rightly point out, there's not a natural suitor that comes to mind in New Zealand, and it is likely to come out of Australia. Channel 9, as you've referred, have the big basket of cash. There's been a lot of speculation that they would look to buy either Southern Cross or Stereo, and if they did that, they would have to close down some of their existing radio assets and broadcast licenses that they have. There's also speculation that they would look to buy QMS and buy media-adjacent properties to build out their portfolio, both of which have potential for Mediaworks. Equally, when Quadrant Media brought out Oaktree Private Equity and the remainder of that shareholding, there's still the issue of the original debt. I'm sure Quadrant brought that at a discount when they bought their shareholding, but that debt will still be sitting there. And one of the options is just to run radio independently in New Zealand for cash to pay down that debt and look at the options in the future. So I think what you've really got is, through this move, optionality. I think all things are on the table for both parts of the business across both countries.
Yeah, we will keep an eye on it. The JC billboard network delivers quality reach via commanding sites to ensure your campaign is visible and impactful. With superior screen quality and premium locations, JC can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more. We're now sort of back on schedule. Maybe my beer's coming back into view.
I'll lengthen you out, don't worry.
Well, this one's quite interesting. So I spoke earlier in the week with Rafiti Connell about some of the sort of media side challenges of the Tom Phillips case. One specific element that has reared up for one media organisation in particular is, and that Stuff, is their decision to publish the audio and transcript of the basically events leading up to the sort of shooting that ended that long saga. And yeah, I'm interested in your view on this. My instinct is to sort of, is to back the obviously this huge. The public is very interested in this. That's not always the same as it being in the public interest. But I think that Keith Lynch, who's done I really admire the way that he started explaining Stuff's thinking in public. I've always liked that as a thing when all news organisations do that, and I think he's doing an excellent job of that. I thought he mounted a pretty good defence, but the police are still considering their options here about whether they might take action against Stuff. That's a scary thing. It also shows Trade Me, the kind of business they're suddenly in.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that angle. You're right.
Well, yeah, this is, I think that you can look at it through just a pure sort of audience and business lens, and then suddenly you're like, oh no, news, not always, but goes through periods where it's really prickly in terms of how it engages with other institutions in society. Tell me your view on this one.
Yeah, and so the first principles here: is it in the public interest, or is it interesting to the public? As you say, is a really interesting perspective on this. Look, I have a very personal perspective on this, and it goes back to a time where there was no social media and things were reported a little bit more slowly. But my father was involved in the Aramoana situation as a police officer, and he was a member of the anti-terror squad, and during media coverage of that, they accessed police radio, and my father's name came across the radio, and that had a huge impact on all of a sudden making clear who members of the anti-terror squad actually were. That had always been kept confidential prior to that, and that had a roll-on impact, not just for my dad and the members of the Terror Squad, but their families, and I saw that play out firsthand in terms of the harm it created. I was 16 at the time, and it had an impact on me at school because everyone all of a sudden knew who my dad was. And so these things, when they're released, can have unintended consequences, right, in terms of how they can create harm. And so I have a personal view to go, you know what, I think ideally, we should be letting the police do their work, get through their investigation, interrogate, absolutely as media should, the outcomes of that investigation. But I don't sit on the side of, recording and publishing police, private police radio calls.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting you say that, because I think when you sit within media and journalism, you develop a particular kind of institutional, collegial response to these kind of challenges. And if I'm honest, I think police, from a communication standpoint, can feel above the law is going too far with it, but certainly they don't have the same kind of set of constraints on them that other parts of government do. The example I spoke about this earlier in the week is that when I reached out to police comms for comment on something and get just no response, no acknowledgement. Any other part of government, you hear back from them, and it's considered part of your sort of the duty that exists in your kind of relationship with news media, and police can sometimes feel like it just it operates on its own terms, and whatever it says just needs to be accepted because of the sort of nature of their work. However, and there are so many very legitimate questions that need to be asked about the Tom Phillips case, particularly how it was allowed to go on for so long.
And I think they will be asked.
And they will be asked. But I think the point you make about how these sort of things play out and how you judge when when the public's interest is served versus there are things that even as kind of journalists and might be very experienced, the operational impact of them might not be clear to us when we're trying to make a judgment call here.
And I think there's a line, right? And it's like, I think you're spot on that police intentions, the way they go about things, they shouldn't be shrouded in secrecy. I'm not suggesting that at all. There should be public interrogation, and I think there often is. What I'm saying is, in this case, where you've had a police officer shot, family and trauma, communication that's critical to, no doubt, an investigation, and not just of Tom Phillips, but the police response to all of that, should be held until such time as the Police Conduct Authority have done their job, and then we can go and interrogate from that point. Creating additional trauma via the police and the family at this point, I'm not necessarily.
Yeah, and especially when it was days afterwards, it's not it might not be a never. It's just it's a not necessarily now. I can absolutely understand that perspective. We just heard in the background that the timer go off. It's going to be touch and go, this beer. We're on our last topic, though.
How long have we got?
We've got 6 minutes right now.
I'm just drawing you out a little bit.
So tell me, the top line for me, this quite extraordinary Skydance, which had been David Ellison, Larry Ellison, the Oracle founder's sons. It almost looked like his toy, this media company that had been trying to get involved in Paramount. You could do a whole episode on the sort of Viacom, Sumner Redstone saga there, but just finally got through and suddenly feels like it's incredibly acquisitive, and partly that's driven by the fact that Oracle's just had this enormous run-up in its share price that briefly made Larry Ellison, David Ellison's father, the richest man on earth.
$383 billion for a day.
It's a decent sum. And it's a huge amount of firepower, more than probably exists anywhere else in the pure media business or institutional media business. Talk through what's happened in recent times in terms of Skydance and its kind of acquisitive warpath.
Yeah, well, the context for this, as you say, is access to unlimited capital without necessarily the constraints that a publicly owned company would need to, employ. So, obviously, David successfully bought Paramount. Within days, announced a very long-term, very expensive deal for UFC. Bought the rights to that. In more recent days, it's come out via I think it was New York Times, maybe article that he and his team via Redbird Capital, which his father obviously has a substantial ownership in, are looking to put an all-cash offer in for Warner Brothers Discovery. That would be, so, if you think about, I think they paid about $8 billion for Paramount. To buy Warner Brothers Discovery would be $50, $60, $70 billion. So, a step change increase in scale. Warner Brothers Discovery had already announced that they were going to split the company into two parts into next year. Ellisons saying he wants to buy all of it. The offer hasn't actually come through yet, so there's a little bit of speculation around it, but it's had positive impacts for both stock prices for Warner Brothers and for...
And that's rare, right? Typically with this kind of thing, you see there's the company that is likely to be acquired, that'll get a bump because typically an investor will pay a premium, but the acquiring party often sees their share price go down, and that's I think there is an expectation that this could be a something that is, at least just because of that giant pile of cash behind it, something that is positive for both parties.
Yeah, and look, my theory behind that is the optics of what David appears to be doing is building this incredible media company, because there's rumours that through the Ellisons connection to Trump that they are in the mix to be a buyer or acquirer of TikTok in the US. So if you start to put long form, short form video assets at this sort of scale together, you've got an incredible media asset. And if you've got unlimited capital to be able to throw into that, you can ride that out for a number of times until you get the business model that you want. And that then becomes a really interesting competitor to the likes of Netflix and YouTube.
Yes. I mean, it's a really interesting story, not just because of what is being built, but almost how they are being granted permission to do it. Now, these kind of acquisitions are typically very interesting to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the American equivalent of the Commerce Commission. They would take a long time to get approved, but that connection to Trump that you mentioned has clearly been something that has been worked on by the Ellisons, particularly Larry, over a period of time. There's always, as soon as Trump started floating the idea of the sort of US part of TikTok being pulled out of away from its Chinese parent, Larry has been the kind of presumptive buyer of it. And so and there's kind of national security reasons for that and all kinds of other things, some of which are totally genuine to my mind. But the interesting thing is that rolling all this stuff up, part of how they seem to be making the case to Trump, the sort of signaling aspect of it is by saying we will be a different kind of media company, that Hollywood liberal kind of peak woke thing that you, as in Trump, have had a problem with. You won't have an issue with that here. And part of how they're doing that is, obviously there was the 60 Minutes settlement that felt pretty... there was, widely framed as a bribe in June, I think, of this year. But also part of this big bundling, and it's a relatively small part in terms of the cash transaction, but in terms of the signaling, it's really profound, is they're talking about buying the Free Press, which is Barry Weiss, who came out of the New York Times and has built this kind of a bit of a juggernaut on Substack of a sort of it's a smart anti-woke media company. I don't personally think as a product it's delivered on what it promised, but they're talking in the $100 to $200 million range, and then Barry Weiss coming on to run CBS News, which is broadly considered one of the most straight down the line news big news organisations.
Considered the jewel in the crown. It really is.
Absolutely. So there is a strong sense that we will build this giant thing, and you can trust us to report the news in a way that you would approve. So it really does. The kind of crony capitalism elements of it are right there, right out in front of it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think the signals coming out of the Trump government at the moment are very emboldening and empowering for the big tech companies and the media companies, because I think they aid America's interests and position on the world stage. So he's enabling them, as much as he possibly can, as well as taking, some lawsuits along the way to remind them of his position.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because for all that, the business side of it, you want to be differentiated in market, and that does appear to be a lane that is available in a mainstream context. Putting together all of the streaming assets, the catalogue would be unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Would top Netflix, and then you still have to build the technology and the brand and the customer customer set, but the assets, the IP, and the content you have is extraordinary. And then, weirdly, with TikTok, I don't see it connecting up as beautifully to the main thing. It's a great asset. You wouldn't not want to own it, but it's quite a different media form to me.
Although, have you seen the rise of the microdrama in Asia on short-form video streaming platforms?
I've not seen it, but I've read about it. My personal feeling is that there are so many things like social shopping, which are phenomenons in Asia that are, talked about when, not if, but they just never seem to arrive. And I think that there are kind of cultural differences that mean that those things don't necessarily come across. Microdramas might be a different one, but I want to see it because we do have Quibi floating in the background. My
daughter watches all of her movies and series on TikTok in 20, 30-second increments. That's what she does. And so I can kind of see how they're going, right, we've got this incredible engagement platform. We've got AI coming, which gives us, some interesting technology production capability. We've got IP. We've got long-form, short-form capability. I don't think they need to have all the answers at the moment, but having the assets and the platforms allows them to figure it out.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, if nothing else, being able to kind of drop a sort of a house ad into your highest engagement video platform in the country, and where downstream you can kind of, whether it's subscribers or other ad dollars you can put in, that's pretty powerful.
This is also, sorry Duncan, one last thing. This is the tough thing for local players. When you see these sorts of things and these types of innovations happening at a global scale, and there's a lot of sunk investment going on at a local scale around a particular path, but then all of a sudden you find in 12, 18 months' time the world's changed again, and that investment doesn't suit any more the needs of the consumer. These are real challenges, right?
You're so right, and it can make everything that we talked about before now seem like a rounding error.
Yep.
And if you look behind, what's driving all this is the fact that OpenAI put sort of $60 billion worth of forward orders into Oracle, which pumped up Oracle stock price by $400 billion, and enables them to do all this without even feeling it remotely.
Yep.
And that changes the whole world. Even if we're wrong, even if AI is a bubble and we're wrong about all this, the downstream impacts of the volume of investment going in for, news and entertainment media, which is itself a rounding error in the kind of technology space, it's a really, really tricky business. We are now officially well over time. The beer is...
two beers.
Two beers? Jesus, okay. That's a tough bargain. But I'll take it. Thanks so much, Glenn. This was really fun.
Thanks,
we got through a lot. Thank you, Jen, for recording. Seeing is not enough. With optimized data tools and insights, the JC2Co Billboard Network helps brands be remembered. Dedicated to closing the loop between impression and action, JC2Co can help your campaign be seen and be remembered. Visit www.beseenberemembered.co.nz to learn more.